There's a storm across the valley. The clouds are rolling in. The afternoon is heavy on your shoulders. There's a truck out on the 4-lane, a mile or more away. The whining of his wheels just makes it colder.
Welcome to Community Forum. Today is May 3rd, 2023. My name is Priscilla Almquist-Olsen, your host, and today we have a very unique program, significant program to Easton and its history. I want to welcome Eric Schultz. I call him Professor Schultz, although he is not, but he acts like one and he deports like one. And we have the Ames brothers, David and Fred. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And we're going to start with Eric's, some of his bio, and I have to read some of it. What's interesting is that his career has been in entrepreneurial roles in cable television. He was co-founder and president of Atlantic Adventures and chairman and CEO of SensTech, which was a venture-backed business twice named to the 500 group before being acquired by Carrier Corporation. But his avocation has been in history and genealogy, and as such he was chairman of the Gettysburg Foundation as well as the New England Historic Genealogical Society. He's written several books, co-author of Food Foolish, The Hidden Connection Between Food Waste, Hunger, and Climate Change. That's an interesting one, and that's a contemporary cry for a solution. And King Philip's War. Now, some of you remember that Eric was on the panel with town historian Ed Hands, Marion Wingfield, who was employed by museums and most recently by Ames Free Library, as well as David Ames. And today we have David here with us again. And so it's a rematch of some sort. And the former program was on King Philip's War, and that was the title of one of Eric Schultz's books. The History and Legacy of America's Forgotten Conflict, and which was the King Philip's War, and he was author of Weathermakers to the World. His bachelor's degree in history is from Brown University, and he did his MBA at Harvard Business School. And so, first off, and we're going to be here today to talk about his latest book, which is called Innovation on Tap, in which he devotes a chapter to Oliver Ames, the founder of the Ames Shovel Works, who came to Easton in 1805, I think, to start his business making shovels, and what that legacy is today. So Eric, first off, you have a dual personality, don't you?
Well, thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it. David, we have to stop meeting like this. Fred, it's nice to be with the Ames brothers here on this panel.
I mean, you've allowed your avocation to take precedence.
Yeah, my career has been in business and in entrepreneurship, but I've never strayed too far from history during that period, and I've always tried to find ways to mix those two things together. In 1995, I joined a company called SensTech, which is in the cold chain monitoring business. And in the course of the next few years, I met a guy named Henry Ames. Henry turned out to be a fantastic sales guy, a high quality general manager. He ended up taking over about half the business and running our life sciences division. And in the course of that, we also became friends. And Henry learned about my interest in history, and he kept saying to me, you really ought to go down to Easton. There's a really interesting story down there about Oliver Ames and shovels. And I kept putting him off because it's hard work and it's busy trying to grow a company and raise a family at the same time. But when we sold Sensitech to Carrier in 2006, I finally had a chance to start doing some exploring of my own. And that's when the idea of innovation on tap came along. That's when I got in the car with Henry and we came down to Stonehill and to Easton, and we spent some time with the shovel collection with Nicole. Greg Gaylor is a Brown graduate. He's younger than I am, but was very helpful in the course of putting this research together. And Oliver turned out to be a perfect guy for one of the chapters in my book. We could talk about that a little bit more, but he was, Fred, the youngest. I think he would get a kick out of being called Old Oliver because he was the 10th and
Yes.
youngest child. He had an overachiever brother, David, oldest brother, who we'll talk about in a few minutes. And he also had triplets, I think, in front of him. So I suspect he was young Oliver for most of his life, and he would be shocked to find out that he's suddenly Old Oliver to his family.
You know, I did a little checking on the genealogy yesterday, and he was the first Oliver in the family. And in 2004, there had been 22 other Olivers.
Really, so hence Old Oliver is the right way
Yeah,
to it,
right.
as versus Governor or,
Yeah.
or some other, yeah.
And how many Davids would there be, David?
I didn't check.
Now that we know that David was Oliver's older brother.
Yeah, I didn't check.
So
I think it's two, David. You're half the Davids.
Well, it was David and David Jr., because I have been to the David Jr. house in Springfield.
Oh, the other
So
David Jr.
there must be 3 of us.
So when you think about doing the research for Oliver, there is Winthrop Ames's 1938 Family History and Genealogy, which is excellent, very helpful. Greg Gaylor did his doctoral thesis at MIT in 2001 called Forging Ahead. And that's a history of the Ames shovel works through 1861.
And let's talk about Greg Gaylor was an Easton resident for many, many years, active in the Historical Society and Commission. And I don't remember what his professional life was like during that time, but he has served the Whaling Museum. He's the Historic Preservation
Right.
Organization in Boston, which is a statewide group.
He was the curator of the Industrial History Center at Stonehill, was his official title when he was here in
That's
Easton.
right. He was the curator, right.
So, and he was a great help. Greg and I actually spent a day at the Yankee Steam Up, which if you ever get a chance to see that, that's quite an event in Rhode Island. But Greg was very helpful. And then there was a terrific Atlantic Monthly article that came out in 1870 called A Day at the Shovel Works or something to that effect. And then William Chafin's History of the Town. And those were the four sources that I looked at, as well as meeting with some of the family members and having Henry as a guide and Greg. And as I was going through Winthrop's history, there's this funny gap. It's like the gap in the Watergate tapes. Oliver is invited by his brother David to go to Springfield, the Springfield Armory, where David has been named the first superintendent in 1794. When Oliver turns 18 in 1797 or 98, he's invited by his brother out, and he works there until 1803. So you get Winthrop saying he leaves for Springfield, and in 1803 he's back and he has a wife, and he started Shovel Works. And I thought, what if I focus in on those 5 years? What happened in those 5 years that might have informed the story of Oliver and his Shovel Works? And so that's where I began. And when you do that, you start really with his father, who we know made a batch of, Captain John made a batch of shovels 6 or 7 years before Oliver was born, and then his brother, and I joked that he was an overachiever, but David was really something. He was named by George Washington in 1794 to be the first superintendent of the Springfield Armory. Before that, it had been the arsenal. It had been the storage place of weapons and ammunition. But after that, it was the place to make guns. And they were trying to make the smooth bore flintlock. I'm not a gun guy, but I did enough reading to know it was based on a French design. And David's job was to get this armory up and running. And in the course of doing that, he assembled, I think, probably what I liken it to is if you were a young executive in the 1950s and you had a chance to work at IBM or Xerox, or maybe you're an AI person now and you get to work at Google or Microsoft or a place like that. It was probably the best training for a young entrepreneur in the early republic possible for Oliver to go out there. And my sense is that when he left, he was in Bridgewater at the time or Easton, but when he left, he had in mind what his father was, which was a village smithy, a local blacksmith who sourced, he was something more than that, I would say Captain John was, but he sourced local bog iron, for example, and he worked in a very contained area. When he got back in 1803, he was a 19th century industrialist.
Now, one thing I want to jump in with Captain John was he was one of the designated gun makers in the Revolution. And I'm sure young David, I'm sorry, I'm doing it again. I'm sure young David worked with his father when he was young in the manufacture of guns. So maybe Washington saw that on his resume, I don't know. But Captain John made excellent shovels, and he was also skilled enough to build good rifles for the Revolution. So that's sometimes overlooked, David's exposure to gun building in his youth.
Right. And they were neighbors with the Orr family. Hugh Orr was, they think, made probably the first muskets in America in 1748. So there may have been some transfer of knowledge there between he and Captain John, which went to David, which went to Oliver in the end. Because later you'll find that David has hired Robert Orr, Bobby Orr, if you will, Robert Orr, the son of Hugh, in Springfield. So there was sharing. Winthrop says he doesn't think David ever met George Washington. Captain John and Washington were almost contemporaries, almost born and died in the same year. But when David is appointed by Washington, he doesn't think he ever met with him. And the key there is usually there's a child named, George Washington Ames, and I don't think we've come across any of those. When they meet Washington, they usually name a child after him. So old Oliver, at the time young Oliver, goes out and works with his brother. And I was trying to imagine the dynamics. David has assembled probably the finest 20 or 30 craftsmen and iron workers in the New World in one spot at the Springfield Armory. And he's been given a task that has never been given to anyone that I know in human history before. He's been told by the United States government, because of this line in the US Constitution, which is to provide for the common defense, he's been told to build muskets as quickly and as at high quality as he possibly can, and he's allowed to spend money to invent any new process he needs. At the time, they were going for interchangeable parts. Any new process he needs in order to do that. I don't think anyone in the world had ever been given, first of all, innovation only came along with the Industrial Revolution. Before that, if it wasn't fixed, if it wasn't broken, you didn't fix it, because if you tried to invent a new plow, you might starve the next year. So innovation is new, and then to be able to innovate without regard for economic return is something that's entirely new to the world. And that was David's charge. And now he has his younger brother out on the floor. I'm wondering about the dynamic there, because
Well, there is 19 years difference.
correct.
So it's almost like another, virtually another generation.
It's like
So-
his a second father, right?
Yeah.
And so David has an incredibly difficult job, mainly because the machine tooling that he needed in order to really do interchangeable parts didn't exist yet. And he was trying to build it. But his younger brother now is out, his eyes and ears on the production floor. I imagine Oliver had quite a time out there when he first arrived in Springfield. But that dynamic then is build fast, be innovative. You can spend as much money as you need because the existence of the United States is at stake. If France or Great Britain attacks the country and we don't have enough muskets, then we're gone. So there's an existential risk. There's no real economic factor here. And so high quality, high speed, and new production processes. And these are the things. And by the way, when you make a musket, it's probably the most complicated manufacturing task in North America at the time.
So there was preparation. I think that is the one thing that most of us don't realize, is that George Washington was preparing for war, preparing for revolution. He didn't just say, oh, bring whatever muskets you have and we'll see what we can do here to defeat the English. No, he was preparing by giving David Ames, older brother of Oliver, who was head of the armory at Springfield, the go-ahead to innovate And of course, that is the name of Eric Schultz's new book, Innovation on Tap. And so you have chosen several people who fit that description of being innovators. And how did Oliver then innovate with the shovels? After all, his father had made shovels, right? So he wasn't really the original shovel maker, but he obviously perfected it.
So what Oliver saw David and the group in Springfield do is go from, I think their first year they made something like 250 muskets to 400 a month by the time he left. So they were making close to 5,000 muskets a year.
Now, my question from reading your book is how does, oh gosh, what is the word? How does assembly line come into this? I mean, my impression was in Springfield, when David left, it was still basically an artisanal approach and not an assembly line approach. And I think with the long shop here, Oliver really went for an assembly line approach. How does that all shake down?
So the holy grail of manufacturing in the early republic was interchangeable parts. Jefferson thought he had seen it in France. It's unclear now what he actually saw, but he thought he had seen it in France. And the idea was if you had true interchangeable parts in a musket and two of them broke on the battlefield, you didn't have to retire them both. You could swap parts and have a working musket. I don't know whether that actually happened or not, but that was the idea. And interchangeable parts will be a theme now through the entire 19th and 20th century. It'll go from there to farm equipment like International Harvester. It will be typewriters. It will be sewing machines. It will be bicycles, and eventually it will end up with Henry Ford on the moving assembly line. So interchangeable parts is the holy grail. That's David's task. At some point, we know Eli Whitney came and visited with David. We think Eli may have tried to steal a couple of his employees, so that was going on even back in the early part of the 19th century. But Eli Whitney will eventually be the father of interchangeable parts. But when the historians at MIT look at what he actually did, they'll discover that he probably didn't quite get there. It's a famous lathe by I'll think of the name in a second. Thomas. Anyway, the lathe is what's required to do things like stocking. So the stock on the gun was an irregular part that was very hard to do consistently as an interchangeable part. You needed special machine tools to do that. The lock itself was multiple pieces, and that was maybe the hardest thing to create in the entire project. And so that was what they focused on. And I think David felt the pressure from 1794 until he leaves around 1802. He feels constant pressure from Washington to step up the pace, to change the production, to make it as close to interchangeable parts as he can, and to never sacrifice on quality. And all those things you start to hear about in the shovel business in Easton.
Okay, so I made a mistake. It was 1794 that this is happening.
So David is named in 1794. That's right.
Yeah, so sorry.
That's right. And then Oliver goes out about 1798, and then David becomes the first paper maker in the Connecticut River Valley. So he's a very interesting character.
But to your mix up on dates, I mean, there was the War of 1812 came up. There was certainly instability. The young country was very vulnerable, very weak. So I think it was to prepare for a war. You know, if there was a subsequent war. Yeah.
Right. So. In 1798, the government authorized $800,000. Some of it would go to Springfield to help David out. Some of it would go to this brand new place called Harper's Ferry down in Virginia, which was going to be the second Springfield Armory. And then they offered contracts to any private individual who could produce guns. And I think they had 26 takers. So to your point, there's this cat named Napoleon over in Europe who's causing all these problems, and they're worried that the United States is going to be in a war. And once that happens, all the flow of guns from Europe stops. And if you're not making them domestically, you don't have guns. And that was David's charge.
Well, that was true for shovels, too. I mean, that gave Oliver the shovel maker a boost as well.
Correct.
Napoleon. Yeah.
That's right. So Oliver comes back in 1803, and then when you pick up the story with Winthrop Ames in his 1938, he's married, and he's starting to make shovels. And, of course, he does some other things, too. He tries to make hose for a while. He goes off to Plymouth. But when he settles back in here, the numbers start to look like what he saw at the Springfield Armory, right? By the 1820s, making, I think, 36,000 shovels a year. And it goes from there, and he gets up to about, at the time of his death in 1863, 750,000 shovels a year. So the numbers are extraordinary. And he fit perfectly in the theme of those first two parts of my book is mechanization, how you move from craft to mechanization, and then mass production. And he hits both of those right on the button.
So, what do you think has been his legacy, Eric?
Well, you want to?
Well, I
ask
would,
that.
I think that, you know, to a considerable extent, his legacy was through his family. You know, I think that he was able to develop Oakes and Oliver particularly to a point where they could rise up to the national scale, and they also were, I think, in Easton they were very civically committed, and not that Oliver wasn't, old Oliver, but they invested in endowments for education and for what was it? Roads?
Yeah, roads
Highways.
and trees and all that good
Which
stuff.
was, of course, that was an old Oliver.
Well, that's what he wanted. That was
focus.
the position he wanted, was Commissioner of Roads, right?
And I understand that he had that for his whole life after he got back to Easton. And the story, I was rereading Winthrop, and it was very interesting because Winthrop says that he personally laid out Center Street when it was extended from North Easton to this Easton Center. And he had a double yoke of oxen, and he was behind the oxen. So when you drive down
They had
Center
names,
Street,
I think, didn't they?
I think of that.
It's interesting you mentioned roads, because one of the book is intended to do two things. It's intended to be a general history. So if you're interested in the history of business or innovation in America, it was written for you, but also it's intended to be a teaching tool for entrepreneurs. So in each of these chapters, there's a few lessons that I try to sprinkle through. And one of the lessons with Oliver is this. We, sometime in the I'm going to say 70s or 80s, sociologists came up with this term called the fundamental attribution bias. They said all human beings have biases, all kinds of biases that make it hard for us to make good decisions. But all of us have this bias. And very simply, it says when we analyze a situation, any situation, we always place too much emphasis on the individual and not enough on the context. So you think of, if you're a journalist who has to write about Elon Musk at Tesla, Elon Musk at SpaceX, and Elon Musk at Twitter may be three very different stories by the time you're done. Same guy, same talent, same weaknesses, but maybe very different stories. There's a great, Casey Stengel, when he first started managing, was a terrible manager. He got hired by the Yankees. He won 5 World Series in a row, and I think 7 out of the next 10 years they won the pennant. And then he got hired by the Mets, and was a terrible manager again. And Yogi Berra has this great line. He says, I knew Casey Stengel before he was a genius, while he was a genius, and after he was a genius. And so part of the thinking around Oliver was to say, what was the context in which he built his shovel business? And there's a famous book written back in 1951 by George Taylor Rogers called The Transportation Revolution. And George paints a picture, a very interesting picture, of 4 great waves that swept over the country, just about the time Oliver starts his business in 1803. The first is the building of roads and turnpikes. Right? When Jefferson was elected president and tried to get from Monticello to Washington, D.C., he had to cross 8 rivers, only 3 of which had bridges or ferries. So his horse was in the water as our president trying to get to Washington, D.C. By 1820, you can pretty much get from Maine to Georgia on decent roads. So Oliver's shovel business is the recipient of this tremendous surge in turnpike and road building. Right behind that comes canals. And of course, canals with the Blackstone Canal, the Merrimack Canal, but the big kahuna of canals is the Erie Canal, right? Which is finished in 1825. The steam excavator doesn't come along until 1839. So there are horses who can plow things out. But for the most part, it's built by shovels. Hundreds and thousands of shovels are going out to build these canals. So he gets roads, he gets canals. The next are the steamboats on the Mississippi River. And of course, you don't need a shovel to build a steamboat, but you need a shovel to build Cincinnati and turn it into the port capital of the world, for example, or to let Mr. Procter, Mr. Gamble get soap to market. If you were a farmer before the steamship and you were in Kentucky and you wanted to sell your goods in New Orleans, you floated them down the river on a barge. You broke up the barge and you walked home with your money. So after the steamboat, you now can get back up the river. So that was the third piece, and then the fourth is the big one, which is the railroad, and that comes along in the 1830s. So the context, not to say that Oliver wasn't talented and smart and entrepreneurial, but he rides four great waves, which we now call the transportation revolution in this country. So when you talk to young entrepreneurs, you say, someday you're going to go to an interview and you're going to be asked, what are you good at? And if you say, I'm good at finding the context where I can be successful, that's probably a pretty good answer. It may require a little explanation after that, but finding the thing that matches your talent is really important. And Oliver, I don't think was thinking along those terms per se, but he was this recipient of the building of America, really.
Yeah, and his sons, Oakes and Oliver, were responsible for building the Union Pacific Railroad. So,
and to your point earlier, they were prepared to step up on a national stage. Right? They were friends with Lincoln, right? So that's a long way from a little shovel shop, right, in West Bridgewater or Northeastern.
But Oliver was also big on education. So Oakes and Ames, didn't they both go to Harvard?
No. Oakes didn't go to college, and Oliver, when he injured his back, he was thinking he would be a lawyer, and he went to Andover Academy, and then he read law with, I guess, a lawyer, and then he decided that he really didn't like it, and he went back to Easton to be part of the shovel works.
In those days, there were no law schools. You read, with a lawyer. In other words, you learned by apprenticing to a lawyer, and then you took the bar exam.
Right.
In fact, in some states, even today, you can go 2 years to law school and apprentice one year. I know when I was practicing in New York State, that was the rule, and one of my friends actually did that, and she was a much better lawyer than her husband.
we did have a lawyer, an Ames. We did have an Ames Harvard graduate. I think everybody says, well, Fred Ames was the first. Our great-grandfather, was the first to go to Harvard. Well, there was a bit of a gap. There was, I believe it was William Ames was the class of 1645 at Harvard. But there was a little gap till the next Harvard grad.
I have to say that the Ames family is a model for how you keep your history perpetuated and together, and to teach new generations the history. It really is a model for how it can be done. It's inspiring. I know you have an annual, or try to do an annual.
That's Brother Bill. Brother Bill, who's coming in later. Yeah. Yes, he does that very well. It's a very big production he puts on. Yeah.
And I meet this sales guy named Henry Ames, who turns out to know the entire history of the family and know why it's important, and that drew me into it. So
and I think it helps. Don't you think, David? We have everything is sort of concentrated. I mean, the family built this building, and
Yes.
it was Will Ames, the spite shop, right? He felt he could build a better shovel than his cousin, so he built this thing, and so it's called Will's Spite Shop.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So it's all around, and I think that helps to have it, as opposed to making the fortune in investment banking or something that's sort of intangible. We actually have a hands-on to all the assets that made the money.
And when something is worn out or about to be destroyed, it gets refurbished and rebuilt and rethought, which is really, so it stays here. It's
Yes.
which is
Repurposed,
great.
yep.
Yeah.
And I think that is really interesting to me, because I think that has carried on. You know, our family has dispersed to a considerable extent, but the buildings that were here through our family have not been taken down and replaced with a housing development. They're being used by various not-for-profits and used very well. So it's that may be getting to the legacy you were talking about, Priscilla.
One of the source documents that I failed to mention at the beginning but exists and is worth people visiting are old Oliver's journals, which are held at Stonehill. They start in 1842, and they are actually legible, which is nice. Old Oliver had a way of writing which you could actually read. So many of the old source documents are hieroglyphics. And what I thought was interesting about them when I looked at them was that if one of us who'd been in business were to put a journal together, a business journal, it would be revenue and competitive this and profit this and operating stuff this. None of that. You could tell by how he was thinking. He was thinking about assembling water rights and innovation and new machines and backstrapping shovels, new inventions around shovels, and the Ames bend and all the things that came up in a way that was very different than what a modern CEO might think about. And when he dies, Oliver's very interesting. He's born between Valley Forge and Yorktown during the American Revolution, and he dies after Gettysburg and just before Chickamauga, I think, and during the American Civil War. And he keeps the journal almost up to the last day of his life, and then his son continues it. And the very last entry in the journal by his son, when he stops it in mid-1860s, is rainy. And I thought, perfect, because Oliver Ames thought about the weather every single day of his life, at least until they had steam. Because if you didn't have water, if the pond wasn't full, you weren't running your production that day, and you didn't have a business.
Well, as to that, there's I assume it's true, the story of his diary. And on the day his wife died, he started off with the weather report. Then his wife's death was second.
Yeah, exactly. Weather was everything. And I remember walking around with Greg and Gaylor, and Greg saying, "Now look at this spot for me, and what do you see?" And I saw a tree and a house, and he said, no, Oliver would have seen the slope of the land and would have been wondering about which way the water was running on this land. That would have been the first thing he looked at. And I thought, how interesting that was for us. We just need to know if we need an umbrella in our galoshes when we get up in the morning. And his was about perpetuating a business, the weather. So, and water rights, of course, were a huge deal. To be able to assemble them effectively took real talent. Because every time you got a water right, you disrupted someone else's field or plowing. So it was a very interesting and difficult thing to assemble. So he was good at many things. And the things that he really features are his inventions. He really was an innovator. He loved when he got a patent on a new shovel. By the time he dies, I think they have 22 different shovels that are.
Okay. I was wondering about that.
Yeah, I think there's 22 different models.
The original Core 22 with the collection of 765.
Yes. Well, of course, shovels are the big shovels are what Taylor focuses on when he talks about the scientific method for management, right? He goes down to Pittsburgh and and watches those guys shovel. And all I could think of was those have to be Ames shovels.
Yeah.
So Oliver, although he was concentrating every moment of his life on the business and how to be sure that it was efficient and that it actually happened every day if the weather cooperated. But there was a tendency also to leave a mark, a physical mark on the community. So maybe David and Freddie, you could talk about the legacy of the Ames family in terms of the buildings, hiring Henry Hobson Richardson as the architect in the 1870s, and so forth, and on Ames, the band, the baseball teams and all that. There was a real interest in providing really for all the workers, because let's remember, it was all the Irish and the Swedes who did all the work. When my mother was growing up, and she lived from 1911 to 2000, there were 5,000 people in East End, 5,000. And half of them were Swedes, half were Irish. And the Ames, from my understanding, they sought out these immigrants because they knew that both the Irish and the Swedes were very hard workers and also could do the job. So tell me, what was their legacy in terms of what they wanted to do for the workers and for their families? In other words, for the community.
You looking at me?
Well, I could say a couple of things, and it just occurred to me. The temperance movement, I think old Oliver was persuaded that imbibing could be a big problem for his business and for his workforce, and he joined the temperance movement on his own, and he then determined that the drink that the workforce would be supplied with would be this concoction that he made up that I guess had one of its signal virtues was no alcohol in it. And he then said, okay, so I've taken away this. I'm going to put in the paycheck of my men the cost of the rum that I'm not buying for this drink. So I thought that, that was kind of interesting. The other thing I remember, and Fred, you may have seen this too, in Winthrop's book, he talks about the general store. And the general store was still around when Winthrop was a boy, which must have been, I guess, 1880 or 85, something like that. But he said that it was essentially a monopoly. Really, Easton did not have any other facility for people to get, food and clothes and everything they needed. So the general store was it. And he said in the book, it was rather amazing, but the general store was one of the only general stores that operated at a loss. And I guess that the theory was that the workforce needed these items of food and clothes and so on, and we're not going to sell them at an outrageous profit. Just make it available. Those are the two things I can think of.
So that was the beginning, David, wasn't it, of their generosity on a smaller but more practical scale. Interesting you should mention the teetotaling Oliver, because my grandfather, who emigrated from Sweden in 1888 and worked at the Shovel Works, of course, he started an organization in Swedish. It's called Godtemplar, and that was a temperance organization. And in those days, there were many Swedes who joined it, maybe not so much because they wanted to give up alcohol, but because of the social engagement that they enjoyed and needed back then. So, the Swedes were doing my grandfather was doing his part too, to keep the Swedes sober so that the workforce would be successful. Freddie, so there are other legacies that Oliver started, but his children perhaps carried on. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
I will try. Just one more story on the temperance. There's another apocryphal tale that, Oliver gave up the booze, but he died 6 months later, and that was always attributed his death. But anyway, who knows? Who knows if that's true? I think with old Oliver, he was very much the fortune builder, and he was, very focused on the technology. He was, as in your book, he was an expert business manager. He survived a lot of panics and crashes that other shovel makers went under. And roads in Easton. I mean, I think it was very basic with the roads, with the schools. And what he allowed with the success of the shovel company was for the brothers to have a broader view, to get out of Easton, to do extensive traveling, looking for business opportunities, investment opportunities. And what was it? Railroads. Railroads played a role, starting with the spur that went to Canton, and then they invested. What was it, David? I think it was in Iowa, railroads. And through railroads, they got to meet Lincoln, who was a railroad lawyer. And it sort of went, one thing led to another. So they were very much on the national stage. And it was really, I think, the generation after that, the Governor Oliver, who was, just to make it confusing, he was Oakes's son. And then there was Fred, who was Oliver's son. When you look around Easton today, they were the ones that sort of left the legacy of the buildings. The governor did the high school, and also Oaks Ames Hall. He was really the prime benefactor of that. And Fred did the library, and he had the Gate Lodge, which is private, but it's certainly an important asset. And then David, you're involved with the Frothingham Park, which was the subsequent generation after that.
Yeah.
So anyway, Oliver tended to business, building the business. I think Oakes and Oliver were somewhat more nationally focused. And then, so I think it really was that generation, the grandchildren of old Oliver were the ones that really created the Easton you see now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It broke a mold because what is it? Jeans to jeans, or dungarees to dungarees in 3 generations. Right?
Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations.
Right. And it broke that mold very much.
Yeah. Well, that knock on wood.
There's still some shirt sleeves out there.
Yeah.
So this is a question for all 3 of you. So what impact did Oliver have? What lessons, if he were here, would he teach us? What lessons did his life teach us for future innovators, for future humanitarians, and generous donors to Easton's beautification and quality of life? So maybe you can comment. Eric, you want to start with that?
Well, I think you've said it well, and that is that a lot of the good was reinvested in the community for the benefit of the community, right? It could have been dispersed. It could have been kept privately. It was given back to the community, and I think that's a tremendous legacy on its own. Look, in terms of being a businessman, he was very much a 19th century owner-operator. He focused on one thing, and he focused on it exclusively. In the beginning, he tried to make some hose at one point, and there were some other things going on. Once he settled on shovels, that was, and if you read the speeches that Andrew Carnegie is giving to the graduates at the turn of the century, it's you put all your eggs in one basket and you focus on that basket, and you don't get distracted, and you don't drink. And there's some of the lessons that he had were carried through. So I think that in terms of being able to focus, being good to your laborers, was there ever a threat of a union?
Well, there was one strike, and I don't know much about it. There was a little set to when the Swedes came in. The Irish didn't like it, and that's why there was separate housing built on the island where they kept the Swedes when they first came, so they wouldn't get revolutionized by the Irish. And but by and large, I think Ed Hands, who's a local historian, the company paid a fair wage. So
that's part of his legacy as well. Just we talked about it earlier, but taking care of your employees.
Yeah. Well, I think when you consider it, Oliver was a local boy, and he was employing people he'd grown up with, I'm sure, and that has to make a difference. And he brought his kids into the shovel works. I mean, Oakes was working in the shovel works as a young man, a young a boy, and Oliver as well, and I think probably William Leonard and of course Horatio. So I think that makes a difference. You know, you're not parachuting in from someplace to make the best of a situation. You're organic.
Is there
Well, also you bring it up in your book after after Oliver's speaking and he's having his drink with the group. The thing you touch on was family, and he had his sons and he had other relations, which were a real asset. I mean, these are the people you could trust, you could work with, and so, as pointed out in your book, that really was, in a sense, his legacy too.
And you said it earlier, there was a certain calmness or consistency to the way he ran his business that I think he learned probably from David. But Greg Gaylor talks about it in terms of he would sometimes short the market. They didn't get all the shovels that they really wanted, and he trusted in some cases his son or a relative to tell that story out in Albany or wherever they might have been located. And by doing that, by not ramping up production in the good times and then getting caught when there was a downturn, he managed to run the company for 60 years. I mean, it was really a remarkable record through probably 4 depressions during that period. And he survived them all. And his ability to think about supply and demand and to work through his family connections, people he trusted with people, and say no when he needed to say no, was really, I think, kept the company in good stead for six decades.
One last comment I'd like to make is that, back in the day, it was normal throughout all industries and businesses to employ people 6 days a week and 10 hours a day. Now, we today might look at that with horror and think, oh my God, but that was the norm. And to hear that Ed Hands has said that it was a fair wage that was given, that restores a lot of confidence, I think, when we think about 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. And I know there was a bell at 6 a.m. to wake everybody up because they had to be at the shovel works at 7 a.m. Am I correct on that? And this bell would just ring, or was it an alarm, or what was it, David?
I think it must have been a bell in the early days.
Yeah, and then at the end of the workday, which must have been, 5 o'clock, 7 to 5? Yeah, there was another bell. Okay, time to go home. And so it was a signal to the families that they would soon have their spouse or husband or son returning for the day.
Well, don't forget the 9 o'clock bell.
Oh, what was that?
The 9 o'clock bell was that it was time for the workers to go to sleep because they had a busy day tomorrow.
Yes, that's right.
There's a great technology historian says we're all focused on the railroad as the sort of the defining invention of the time, but it was the clock. He says to move people from farm, where there was dawn and dusk, and that's how you did your work, to being on a schedule, which was hourly and consistent, was really a great change for a lot of folks around the world, certainly here in America.
And the other thing that was interesting, Oliver divided up all the parts of the business or of the making of the shovel into different buildings. So there was the handle factory, right? The handle where they made the handles, and then the shovel itself.
The hammer shop.
And the hammer shop, right?
Where they molded the blades.
Right.
Then the polishing shops, right, where they finished off or they polished, I guess, right?
It's a little bit like the lock, stock, and barrel.
Yeah.
That he grew up with.
God, I remember going to school past the shovel works because I had to go past it to get up to the grammar school. And they were making those shovels, and it was the noisiest business. My God. Boom, boom, boom. And, we're right up the street from that. And that's the way it was.
If you want to see a trip hammer in action, I don't know if there's one here, but at the Saugus Iron Works, not that far away, they'll run a trip hammer for you, and you get a feeling that no one who worked for Oliver could have heard anything that's good. There's that famous story where one of the workers who worked there a long time, but when he was young and first starting, is at one of the trip hammers, and he feels a whack across his back, and he looks, and it's Oliver, and he's saying, the quality here is not acceptable to me.
Yeah.
So it took that to get his attention. There was
Yeah.
so much noise in that environment.
Yeah.
He was,
Oh,
yeah.
that's amazing.
Well, there's one thing I want to address, and it's somewhat tied up with this about the buildings, you know, the hall, the library, the schools, you know, and all that. Well, there was a scandal with Oaks Ames and the Credit Mobilier, and I've heard this, I've seen it written that the Ameses lavished all this on Easton because of their guilt, that they sort of hid out in Easton, you know, and stayed there. And I've often wondered, how do you hide out if one of your family is governor of Massachusetts, which is that, and the other one is the richest man in the state, you know, the largest landowner in the state. So I don't know where that theory came from, but I hope for your audience and everyone, I have demolished it. So there you go.
Perfect.
Yes, I think it makes perfect sense. Anyway, thank you so much, all of you, David and Freddie Ames, about your family's legacy, and Eric Schultz about recording the legacy of the original Oliver Ames. So we thank you so much for coming. I hope the audience has enjoyed this presentation as much as we have enjoyed presenting it to you. This is Priscilla Almquist-Olsen wishing you well. Until next time, be well.